where we're going to pick up, because I think we finished everything last week.
Yeah, you finished that last week. We're supposed to start on page 37.
37. Whew. Thank you for the save. That's not right. 69?
2 weeks ago.
We have a dissenting opinion.
Iris is the wise.
Oh, she messed my book up.
Yeah. Less than 9. Faithfulness. Well, that makes sense for their passage. That makes sense for their passage today. James 2:14, in case I was unaware. All right, we have a handy. Does Lance write this book?
Yeah.
I'm recognizing Lance's stories here.
Yeah.
Reading the introduction. Sweet tea, very southern thing. What's funny is, so I don't know if you know this, but growing up between the ages of 6 to 11, we were in Hernando, Mississippi. My father was the preacher there. So that's quite a culture shock in my life. Grew up in the South Pacific, moved to Hernando, Mississippi at the age of 5. Get quite enveloped in the southern culture there, baseball, sweet tea, all that jazz. Moved back to the South Pacific, there for 4 years. Then I go to Canada. I'm in Canada for 4 years. So I've got the South, I've got the North. I've experienced both, which does mean I never know what to order with sweet teas on them because of general rule. I just take whatever they got.
I'm surprised you don't say eight.
Yeah, you all.
You know, I've had some interesting accents in my life. I've gotten pretty good at losing them. Should have met me when I sounded half Australian. All right, so faithfulness. Faithfulness begins with God. It is a part of his nature. Lance has 3 passages illustrating that here. If anyone has a book, would they like to read Exodus chapter 34, 6 through 7? Any volunteers? I can do it.
34, 6 through 7.
Yep.
Then the Lord passed by in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the father on the children, and on the grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation.
So, Lance cut it off at verse 7 because it's much easier to do stuff there. So, in that passage, where the Lord is proclaiming his faithfulness, his compassion, his graciousness, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. That's the part of God that we love to talk about. And actually was extremely unusual. If you've ever read any other religious text from that part of the world at that time, this was unusual. Because the gods, no one doubted they existed, and there were multiple, was the other not doubt. And the game was to not anger them. The challenge was you didn't know what made them angry. And I know that's the case because that's the case where I grew up in the South Pacific. They still live that way. That's the culture. Every river, every tree, every hill, every mountain, every village, everything has a spirit. And you don't know exactly what that spirit wants until some iniquity is rained down upon you. You lose family, someone falls ill, the crops die. Just things that always threaten survival occur. And then the challenge becomes, which one did you make angry? Because you had to make one of them angry. Like it's not fair. This is just happening out of the blue. Something has to be angry at you. So then the quest is to figure out who and why. And then that's just a quest in itself. And that leads to all sorts of fun places. If you ever wonder where some of the, terrible practices you read about in the Old Testament for child sacrifice or ritual sacrifice or all these other different sacrifices, generally the consensus is figure out who's mad at you, figure out why they're mad at you. Most of the time it would be logical that a transgression occurred against them. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is the basic assumption of human figure out who messed with the Spirit, and then you figure out what you got to do to make it even. So if you ruined the river, someone's probably going to die. If you offended the God of the mountains through, I don't even know what you do, but you did. You took a dump in the wrong place. I'm sorry, that's crude, but someone's probably going to have to lose an arm, lose an eye. Like that's just the nature. The idea is you are dealing with powers that are more powerful than you, who for the most part ignore you. But if you make them angry, they have it within their power to make your life miserable until you settle the debt. That is the worldview in the animistic, spiritualistic culture. It's still the worldview where I grew up, and I imagine, based upon the Old Testament stuff I've read, that looks like the worldview they had at the time. So the assumption is, that second part, the assumption is that God is just, and that transgression will be met with punishment, and that punishment will be severe. This first part is the unusual part, the idea that, well, one, there is one Lord, and two, that he is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. So in a grand twist in world history, the part that the people at the time would have been found extremely difficult to swallow or believe is what we take for granted today. Like, well, of course, if God is good, God would do this. The part that we find difficult to swallow today is that second part. The justice. The idea that punishment has to occur for transgression. That's the part where I've heard more people say that the Old Testament's just a bunch of crap. Why? Because God is good, you can't do that. So, I don't understand everything, but I do find it funny that what was once absurd is now accepted. What is now considered accepted is absurd. We have gone full 360 from the time this was written until now. We cannot believe a good God would ever punish. And they could not believe a God would be good. All right, Psalms 89, verse 8 is our second example. Who is like you, Lord God Almighty? You, Lord, are mighty, and your faithfulness surrounds you. And again, Psalms 36 and 5. Your love, Lord, reaches to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. So obviously the purpose of this lesson is to talk about faithfulness, and all these passages are proclaiming God's faithfulness. Would anyone like to take a stab at defining what they are getting at by the word faithful in these verses? Like, sometimes when we say we have faith in something, it implies that we believe. Does that make any sense for God in these passages? God, your belief is consistent in us?
I think probably what they're probably alluding to more than anything is the unchanging nature of God. That he's faithful in the respect that he is not arbitrary and not a God who is fickle, but a God who is consistent and who is unchanging.
I concur. And it's that lack of arbitrariness. It is that consistent action. I think that is the point the Old Testament, the psalmist, is getting at here. Because again, the worldview at the time would be the arbitrary and fickle natures of the powers that be that might just be offended over here. Whereas this is trying to dispel all of that.
So, spiritual nature of the folks that you grew up around there, it seems to me that their understanding of their gods, those gods were very consistent as well.
No.
Consistently angry.
Well, it's consistently dangerous.
Right. So
But they could bless as well as curse. But also, sometimes they might just be angry for reasons that have nothing to do with you. Like, think of the Greek myths, where the gods would just go to war with each other because one god offended another, and if you got stepped on because they were fighting, well,
I guess my point it's a little bit more than just consistency with God when you use the word faithfulness. It doesn't have to, but it does imply a good-natured
Yes.
consistency. To have faith in somebody is positive vibes, so to speak. Of course, you can also have faith that they're going to do something wrong too.
Yeah. Well, I think it's the dual nature of God being cast here, because in the Old Testament, they never shy away from the fact that God is just and God is capable of punishment. Like that's all over the Old Testament. That's something we struggle with, I think, today. But it's also that God is consistently good. God keeps his promises. And importantly in this, God communicates with his people. Sorry.
I'm just going to mention, in almost all the other cultures, all the other deities that you've experienced, there is almost, it's exclusively, I think, the case that those deities never invite the human into a loving relationship with them.
Transactional.
Yeah, but not loving. And there's no grace involved with any of the deities. There's no love involved with them. The only thing that you end up with, and this is true, I think, even from what Raheem has said in Muslim cultures as well, is that God invites you into a fear relationship with him in those cultures, not the opportunity to love him in a gracious relationship. And I think that is the key too, is that when you're talking about a faithful God here, he's faithful in his love as well as his justice. And his justice isn't meted out arbitrarily. It's meted out based on the fact of your rebellion and your revolution against him and his desire to bring you back into a loving relationship with him. There is the best you can hope for with the other deities is just an uneasy truce. Never a case where you're invited into a circumstance where you love them.
Yeah. In many cases, there was a belief that if the deity desired something and you could cooperate, they would bless you in return. There's a very transactional nature that's considered in one of these. But the idea of it being a loving, intimate, or even consistent relationship definitely is not present. And in this case, the emphasis is God's faithfulness is. What's interesting about the Old Testament account is that Moses is able to approach God and he returns to the people with the commandments. And then further on, he then communicates all of the laws, like all of Leviticus, all of it. Like there's so much there. And then the promise to the people is that God is faithful to this. Like he's not going to argue. He's creating an agreement, a relationship, a contract, similar to a marriage, in which I am going to be the faithful party here. The question is, are you going to be the faithful party here? And that is kind of amazing when you think about it, because like when you put it in those terms, all of the Old Testament is people failing to be faithful, whereas God is consistently faithful. And we are being held up to keep up our side of that contract. And that continues all the way through to the New Testament, where Paul speaks over and over again the purpose of the law. The purpose was to point out that we were inadequate. Even if we wanted to do everything that God desired, we're fundamentally flawed and faithless. But God had a way around it. But yes, I agree with you. The consistent goodness, the lack of arbitrariness. It's the God that's depicted here is what we wish our legal system was. You know what I mean? We aspire to a system in which everyone is equal under the law. There is no arbitrary nature. If a transgression has occurred, justice will occur. Right? That's the justice that we aspire to. And simultaneously, it's saying that God is the perfect Father. There's the love, there's the relationship, there's the intimacy, which we as people are very coming. I don't know if any of you have been in a situation where you're supposed to root and support and love unconditionally, and then simultaneously act as judge. It's a rough time. But yeah, no, to your point, the way animists or pagans with polytheistic religions, to a T, they always envision the gods as just people, which, again, is why so many people aspire in some of those religions to ascend. All right, 3 phases here. I want us to, he has 3 more verses. I'll read through them quickly so we can take along. Numbers 23:19. God is not human, that he should lie. Not a human being, that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? Obviously, continuing on with the consistency, the faithfulness of God. Just this morning, I woke Shantae up and was like, I'll get you coffee. And then I went out, and one of the kids had a disaster, and I cleaned the dog's mess, and moral of the story, that half an hour later, I never got coffee. Felt bad about it, but that's kind of what you get when you're dealing with people, even with the best of intentions. Sometimes we are faithless in what we say, but we don't have to worry about that with God. Psalms 55:19. God, who is enthroned from old, who does not change, he will hear them and humble them, because they will have no fear of him. In James 1:17, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly ones, who does not change with shifting shadows. 3 phrases here Lance wants us to notice. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? He, speaking of God, does not change like shifting shadows. These are the things that make God faithful. He does what he says. He promises and then fulfills. He does not change no matter what comes. This is faithfulness. That's why we can trust his faithfulness. I've got nothing else at this moment to add there. I think we've definitely covered some of discussing God's faithfulness, his consistency, how these verses have demonstrated it. Does anyone else would like to add? Because the next portion we're going to go into is what God expects of his people.
Going back to Rakim
Yes.
and the Muslims, they believed in Abraham and they believed in Moses. And in that, I found Hebrews 3, Jesus is greater than Moses. And he said, consider Jesus the apostles and the high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him, who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken in later days. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son, and we are in his house. And just what you've been going over is, and why I bring up Rakim is, they cannot go there that Christ is taking care of the house of God. They can't accept the Trinity. And we have that faithfulness because we saw what God did for us.
exact same place, but pretty close. And at the time of Muhammad, the prevailing religion was polytheistic paganism, just like it was in Israel before Israel arrived. And we assume just like it was where Abraham originated. So Muhammad was unusual at his time, in his age, in that he was rejecting the polytheistic concept. He believed that the monotheistic interpretation that the Jews held was correct. Now the difference was he believed he was the prophet of that. So part of the reason Islam proved to be so successful in that region at the time is it was monotheism. They went hard in. God is one. There is one God. Which, if you know anything about Judaism, same phrase. Or the God, or is one. So he was attempting to take that teaching and apply it to his area. Where he erred was with setting himself up as the prophet. Because we, in reading the Old Testament, I don't understand. I've never studied with Muslim Imam. But I would be curious to know how to get around the promises they. Well, actually, maybe they do. Because the promise was to Abraham that the deliverer would come through Abraham. And obviously, we believe that it came through Abraham and David, all the way to Mary and Joseph, and then we have Jesus. So the promised deliverer is the people of God. That was the promise to Abraham. And he is faithful to his promises. He can't break them, right? So I would be curious how they get around that. Like, did he believe that he was a descendant of Abraham and somehow could fulfill that, or do they just completely throw that all out? But it is interesting, if you read any of the history of the rise of Islam, that part of the reason it was so successful was that it's monotheistic. They rejected this whole thing, and they returned to the God of Abraham, is what they believed. But obviously Muhammad went further than that. So no, Jesus wasn't. He was just being his prophet. We can mostly ignore him because I'm real. So we diverge at that. Sorry, does someone have their hand up?
I believe, if I remember correctly, there was somebody that I spoke to a while ago that originally came from the Muslim religion.
Mm-hmm.
The Muhammad was descended from Abraham through Hagar.
Okay, so they do believe he was a descendant of Abraham. Okay. And there's the divergence. Interesting. I don't think he means all the other prophetic remarks, but interesting. At least it's somewhat theologically consistent. But it is, there's three monotheistic religions in the world: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And they all go back to Abraham. What?
The one thing I was going to mention, and what Lance had written there for his phrases that you used to have read,
how do you demonstrate you trust something? You kind of have to act as if you trust. Like, you can't say that you trust something and then act like you don't. It's like, I trust my wife. It's like, then why are you having your tail by a private investigator? It's like, no, I trust her. You know what I mean? It's like, trust implies action, or the trust exercise, where, you know, the silly one they always say for like the business conferences, where it's like, we're going to pair up, and you're going to fall backwards, and I'm going to catch you, right? And it's like, do you believe I'm going to catch you? Yes. Okay, fall backwards. If you fall backwards, you trust them. If you don't trust them. You may believe they'll catch you, but you're not going to put your body in a position to test it. You don't trust them. Yeah, so the love, the faith, the trust. Okay, and that's what God, finishing the line, that is faithfulness. That's why we can trust his faithfulness. And that's what God expects of his people. Joshua 24, verse 14. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. So what would be the trust component? Like he says trust God, but like we just talked about, trust is in action. What's the action he's saying they should do here? I'll read it again.
Get rid of the other gods.
There you go. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness, or with all trust, let's say. Throw away the gods of your ancestors. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Going back to what we talked about before, what might happen if you throw away the gods you worship? Terrible things, right? That's why they worshipped all of them. When Paul gets to, where is it? Is it in Athens where he delivers the sermon? Where he finds to the unknown God, and he's like, yeah, I'll tell you about that guy. Right? Why do you think they worshiped all of them, and that was considered a wise course of action? Don't offend me. So, yes, in this verse, I don't know if it communicates well to the modern mind, the monotheistic mind, but this, now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Everyone's like, yeah, I'll say that. And throw away the gods of your ancestors. You know there was a couple people that didn't want to do that. Because until you do that, you have no skin in the game. The second you toss the old gods, you're falling backwards in that trust exercise. All right. God desires his people to serve him with all faithfulness. This means a total commitment to him. It's not just saying we belong to him but doing it. It's not just a promise to him to do his will but fulfilling that promise. It means making that commitment and not changing like the shifting shadows, whoever our circumstances change. When it comes to any discussion of trust, faithfulness, or love, it's always hard for me to not always tie it back to a marriage. Like those three things that I just said, if we were talking about a marriage seminar, it's not just saying we belong together to our partner, but doing it. It's not just a promise to our partner, but to fulfill that promise to our partner. It means making that commitment and not changing like the shifting shadows wherever our circumstances change. It's not saying 15 years from now, I'm a different person. We're done. You know what I mean? It's the whole concept of this faithful commitment. We find it hard to envision a lifelong commitment of just one life, as opposed to a commitment forever. Read 1 Samuel 26. This is when Saul was seeking to kill David. Notice David's actions. Does anyone open 1 Samuel 26? I think I know the story is getting out, but I do not want to attempt to recall it. I'm never going to mess it up. 1 Samuel 26. When Saul is seeking to kill David. And let's focus on David's actions during this passage. I'm looking for a Bible, so I can read it. Do you want
It
the
was,
whole chapter? There's one there? Well, if I can open it to it, I would happily paraphrase.
it's the story of when David went to Saul's camp,
Yeah.
and his spear was stuck in the ground at Saul's head,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody was laying around him. And David tells Abishai, don't destroy him. But he says that that he take his spear and his water jar.
Mm-hmm.
So then the next morning they say, why are you chasing us? We had the chance to do away with you last night. Here's your spear, here's your water jar.
Yeah. I'm going to read the passage that, thank you, that's exactly, I'm sure, what we're getting at here. Here's the verses that apply. David spares Saul again. Then David said to Ahimelech the Hittite, and to Joab's brother Abishai the son of Zerah, who will go down with me into the camp of Saul? And Abishai said, I will go down with you. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment, with his spear stuck in the ground of his head, and Abner and the army lay around him. Then Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and guiltless? And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let us go. So David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw or knew it, nor could any awake, but they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. I'm going to jump forward to the end of the chapter, verse 21 through 25, where Saul reacts. Then Saul said, I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life is precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly and have made a great mistake. And David answered and said, here is the spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and take it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I will not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Behold, as your life is precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of all tribulation. So, that's the part where David chooses to spare Saul, and then there's the whole drama of David proving that he spared Saul, and then Saul's reaction to it.
But he still didn't trust Saul.
No, he didn't trust Saul, did he? He wasn't stupid enough to hang around. David trusted the Lord. He did not trust Saul. But it's passages like this that make it very hard. I'm always back and forth when it comes to all those various situations where it seems like the ends justify the means. That is a hard problem to get around when you really, really care about the ends. Like if it's saving something you care about, or if it's accomplishing something you care about. It is so tempting to believe that the good that would result can justify whatever actions need to be taken to achieve. And I have no good logical argument against that. The only thing that keeps me from thinking that's probably the correct course of action is all these passages, where the implication is God is faithful. So to do what he would want you to do will result in God's will being done. And we have to believe that God's will being done is the best outcome. So even if David in this situation is like, God anointed me too. My day is coming. Today's the day. I don't even have to kill him. I've got this guy who's willing to do it in one shot. He was bragging about it while the man was sleeping on his floor. Like David could have washed his hands of everything if he was a half-decent lawyer. He would have just turned around, full deniability. But he doesn't. So, is this the faithfulness that God expects from us too? The mutual faithfulness. God is faithful to us, and we are expected to be faithful in return.
The issue is the timeline.
The timeline. When you
here in 31, he takes his life. You know, and God is the God of the living and the dead.
But don't you see how it would be so easy for David to reason that that was the moment? God delivered him into his hands. Isn't that the will of God at that point, that he should stake Saul to the ground?
That's man's thought.
Oh, okay. I think you're right. I think that's the point. But it's so hard. I mean, it's easy reading that in this passage, but as I said, like, I know my weaknesses. I know if I was in David's shoes there, I could come up with 101 ways that this would be the will of God. That's what I wanted to happen. So that's the challenge then for us who want to be the people of God, is how do we rewire ourselves, in a sense, to live faithfully. The problem with our faithfulness is that it often withers. Read the following passages, write about how they align with your own faithfulness. How much time do we have? What have we done? Quarter after, we got 4 minutes. Maybe we shouldn't do that. I don't think we have that time. Leave that to your own exercise if you want. I'm going to jump to just a couple of the questions at the end. We'll see how many we get through before we're on time. Okay. Here are some of the questions we need to ask ourselves. Am I being faithful to the new life I received at my baptism? When we are baptized, we say that we put our old life to death. Did we do that? When we're baptized, we accept Jesus as the Lord of our life. Did I do that? When we are baptized, we are raised to a new life to live for God alone. Did I do that? No matter the circumstance, no matter the cost, I proclaimed at my baptism that I would be faithful to God. Have I done it? I mean, I don't think we're covering that in 4 minutes. But I think it's definitely good to keep those questions in mind. Because today our passage is James chapter, the sermon today will be in James chapter 2, verse 14. Faith without works is dead. So I'm hoping that us reflecting on that passage will help us answer these questions. The very short version is, I think that God knows that just like the Israelites, we would not be able to do this perfectly. I don't think that changed from the Israelites to us. I think that's why Jesus came and died, to cover that shortcoming, to be the perfect sacrifice and the great high priest. So I don't think the perfect life, even if we could live it, would be sufficient to God to save us. But simultaneously, I think that our salvation is tied to our faithfulness to God. And I think our salvation requires, the faithfulness to God requires us living it, us doing it. I don't think the faithfulness to God, having faith in James, I believe, is not as simple as saying, I believe God is my Savior. It's the living, the action, the living a life of trust, the living a life of faithfulness, living a life of love that is the saving faith. Perfection is not demanded, but action is. And that argument has caused all sorts of problems in the church. So anyway, that's what we'll be talking about later. Does anyone else have any comments they want to say before we close out the class?
No, something that Randy said first thing this morning is, it's a gift. We don't deserve it.
Yep.
We don't even expect it, but you call it.
Yeah.
When you accept it, Jesus says, you're that lost sheep.
The other thing is that, we always pivot on the fulcrum of baptism.
Yep.
It's that, but Christ calls us to pick up your cross daily. And so it's not a case it's a one and done thing. It is a day by day, moment by moment life that you're living to live a big life.
I concur. I think, I don't want to go too much into it because we'll talk about it later, but the Catholic Church at the time of Martin Luther was abusing the idea that we live out our faith by what we do. Because they were saying, oh, we'll tell you what it is and you're going to do it. If you don't do it, you're not saved. So I I understand why Martin Luther rejected that. But I think one of the side effects of rejecting that is many branches of Protestantism have gone so far down the by faith alone range that we are afraid to say that salvation, that faithfulness, that trust is what we do. That we've divorced it so far that I was on one, I forget which one it was. I was on an evangelical site that classified the Church of Christ as heretics because we say baptism is required for salvation. We've gone so far down the sola fide, the faith alone path, that to say that God expects action from us, any action, is heresy because it's faith alone. And it's like, it explicitly says, be baptized, confess, believe, love. You know what I mean? Like, these are not optional things in the New Testament. And to say that that is living faith is not heresy. But at the same time, it's not to say that those things are what saves us. Like, both of those things are true. But it's a hard line to draw sometimes.